The sun had barely crept above the horizon when Marcus Thompson stepped out of his modest apartment in the quiet suburbs of Langston, a small town in the heart of Illinois. It was a crisp autumn morning, and the air felt fresh, carrying the promise of a new day. Marcus, a man in his early 40s, had always embraced his routine. A quiet, disciplined man, he wore a well-tailored suit, his briefcase in hand, heading straight for the courthouse. His life had been defined by a quiet strength, working as a defense attorney with a reputation for integrity. But today, he wasn't heading to the courthouse to represent anyone. Today, he was walking in for something much more personal. The night before, he'd received a call informing him that his mother's estate, which had been tangled in legal disputes for years, would finally be settled. This wasn't just any ordinary day. As he walked down the familiar street, he noticed an elderly woman struggling with a heavy bag of groceries. Without thinking, Marcus set his briefcase down and approached her. "Let me help you with that," he said in a calm, reassuring voice. The woman, slightly taken aback at first, smiled gratefully, her eyes shimmering with gratitude. "Thank you, young man," she whispered, her voice trembling from the weight of the bags, but also from the weight of fears. Marcus felt a small flicker of warmth in his chest as he helped her load the bags onto the nearby bus bench. With a final smile, Marcus turned to pick up his briefcase when, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a patrol car slow down as it neared him. He didn't think much of it at first. The streets of Langston weren't usually patrolled much at this hour. But the car didn't just pass him by. It stopped. A white officer, early 30s, with a scowl on his face, stepped out of the car. "You there," the officer called out, his voice loud enough to attract attention from pedestrians walking by. Marcus froze for a second, his instincts immediately going on alert. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had just helped an elderly woman with her groceries. Still, he didn't know what to expect. The officer, eyes narrowing as he approached, demanded to see identification. "I'm just on my way to work," Marcus explained, his voice steady. He had lived in Langston his entire life. He had never been in trouble with the law. But he knew how quickly things could escalate. The officer's sharp gaze didn't waver. There was something about the officer's attitude that felt off. "What's in that briefcase of yours?" the officer asked, his hand casually resting on his holster, his eyes scanning Marcus with the scrutiny of a man who had already decided who he thought Marcus was before even knowing his name. Marcus's stomach churned as the officer's voice dripped with suspicion. He felt the hot sting of a familiar, uncomfortable reality, the weight of racial profiling. But instead of letting the anger rise, Marcus chose calm. "It's just legal documents," he answered, his voice firm but not confrontational. The officer, however, wasn't satisfied. Without another word, he reached for his cuffs and ordered Marcus to turn around. Shocked, Marcus did as he was told. The cold metal of the handcuffs snapped into place. The officer didn't seem to care for an explanation. The small crowd that had gathered around him seemed unsure of what to do. Some eyed him nervously, some whispered under their breath. Marcus could feel the anger building. But he knew what to do. He kept his head down and remained calm. Remembering the countless times he had told clients in similar situations to just hold on to their composure. It's always easier to react with rage, but harder to stay quiet in the face of injustice. But that didn't stop the officer from humiliating him, pushing him roughly against the side of the cruiser. The sharp pain in his shoulder was nothing compared to the sting of the officer's words. "You've been loitering here, and I don't like the look of you. You could be involved in something illegal." Marcus bit his lip to hold back his anger. He had been accused of far worse in his career as an attorney: false accusations, fabrications, and more. But this wasn't just unfair, it was personal. The harsh fluorescent lights in the police station flickered above Marcus's head as he was led through the sterile gray hallways, his wrists still bound tightly by the cold, uncomfortable handcuffs. The sounds of murmurs and footsteps echoed in the air, each one adding to the weight of humiliation that hung heavily over him. He had been processed, fingerprinted, and his personal details recorded as if he were a common criminal. The officer who had arrested him walked ahead, shoulders stiff with a mix of superiority and discomfort. Marcus could feel the eyes of the other officers and station staff as they glanced over at him. Some curious, others skeptical, but none willing to speak up or intervene. He had been in courtrooms before, standing confidently in front of judges and juries. But this was a new kind of battle. He wasn't just fighting for his own freedom, he was fighting for his dignity. "Sit here," the officer barked as he gestured to the hard wooden bench in the corner of the holding area. Marcus complied, sitting down without a word. The handcuffs dug into his skin, but he remained still, focusing on his breathing, reminding himself that this was just another battle, one he would eventually win. But it didn't stop the gnawing anger that simmered just beneath the surface. As the minutes ticked by, Marcus's frustration grew. He had asked several times to make a phone call, to explain the misunderstanding, but each request had been ignored. The officer who had arrested him, young and brash, paced back and forth, muttering under his breath about people who think they're above the law. Marcus tried to ignore him, but the officer's words hung in the air like poison. The tension was palpable. A few of the other officers, clearly more seasoned, shot glances at Marcus but remained silent, as if afraid to get involved in something that could get messy. Marcus's mind raced. He couldn't help but wonder, was this really happening? Was he really being treated like a criminal because of the color of his skin? His thoughts were interrupted when a second officer, older and more composed, entered the room. His eyes briefly flicked over to Marcus, but he said nothing. Instead, he went about his business, processing paperwork and moving with a detached efficiency. A faint sense of relief washed over Marcus. At least this officer didn't seem as eager to escalate the situation. But then, just as quickly, the relief was gone. The young officer, who had been glaring at Marcus with disdain, returned to the bench. He stood over Marcus, arms crossed, an expression of smug satisfaction on his face. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" he said with a sneer, clearly trying to provoke a reaction. Marcus stared up at him, his jaw clenched but his eyes calm. "I'm not here to argue with you," he said quietly, his voice steady. "I just want to get this sorted out." But the officer wasn't interested in resolution. Instead, he reached for Marcus's briefcase, tossing it carelessly onto the nearby desk. The contents spilled out: documents, files, and folders scattered across the surface. The officer glanced at the disorganized papers, his lips curling into a smirk. "What do we have here? Money laundering? Fake IDs?" he muttered, as if the accusation was a foregone conclusion. Marcus felt his chest tighten, but he refused to let the officer see how much his words stung. He knew better than to engage. The more he stayed calm, the more frustrated the officer would become. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Marcus could hear snippets of conversation from the officers nearby, who whispered among themselves about what a waste of time the situation was, and how ridiculous it was that a man like Marcus was even in here. It was clear they had already decided his guilt, and nothing could change their minds. It wasn't long before Marcus was led back to the holding cell, A small, dimly lit room that smelled of stale air and metal. The door slammed shut behind him, and he was left alone in the silence. Still shackled, the sounds of the station grew distant as he sat down on the cold metal bench. His body ached from the strain of the handcuffs. But he focused on the task ahead. He had to remain calm. He had to keep his head clear. He thought about the elderly woman he had helped earlier that morning. He thought about the community he had fought for in his career, people who trusted him to stand up for them, to defend them. He couldn't let this defeat him. Not now. Not ever. The door to the holding cell opened again. And a third officer, a middle-aged man with graying hair, stepped in. He gave Marcus a once-over, then spoke in a low, respectful tone. "You're gonna have to wait until tomorrow for your arraignment," he said. "I can't do anything about it today. But don't worry, we'll get this sorted out." Marcus nodded silently, though he wasn't sure how much to trust the officer's words. All he knew was that he was stuck here for now, with only his thoughts and the sting of injustice to keep him company. Tomorrow, he would face a judge. Tomorrow, his life would either be cleared or destroyed. The following morning came far too slowly. Marcus had barely slept, the cold bench in the holding cell offering little comfort as he lay awake, eyes fixed on the dim ceiling. The officers had been indifferent, treating him as though his entire life was now reduced to a series of assumptions and accusations. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, questions about what had gone wrong, what the officer had been thinking, and what would happen in court. He knew the moment he stepped into the courtroom, it would all either be validated or shattered. There was no middle ground. At first light, he was escorted to the courthouse, handcuffed again, but this time in front of an entirely different crowd, people who would judge him not by the facts, but by their preconceived notions. The courthouse doors loomed large, and with every step, Marcus could feel the weight of those judgments pressing down on him. He had been through courtroom battles countless times, but this was different. This time, he wasn't the one standing behind the defendant's desk, he was the one under the microscope. The cold, unforgiving metal gates of the courthouse swung open as he entered. It was as if every footstep he took echoed loudly in the vast marble hall. A few people turned to look at him as he was led down the long aisle. Some whispered to one another, exchanging curious glances as they speculated about the man in cuffs. Others simply avoided eye contact, their faces carefully neutral. Marcus's stomach twisted in frustration. Why did it have to be like this? Why did the color of his skin dictate how he was seen, how he was treated? But he didn't have time to dwell on that now. He had to stay focused. The courtroom buzzed with uneasy whispers as the judge entered and took her seat. The officers, including the one who had arrested Marcus, stood at attention. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The clerk called out the case number, and when Marcus's name was read, the entire room went silent. His name rang out, followed by the charge: resisting arrest, suspicious behavior, loitering. The charges were so vague and flimsy that Marcus could hardly believe what he was hearing. He had done nothing wrong. His only crime had been being in the wrong place at the wrong time, in the wrong skin. His attorney, a woman in her late 30s, stood up beside him and immediately began to present the facts. How Marcus had been helping an elderly woman, how the officer had acted without probable cause, how no evidence had been found to support the accusation. It was a strong argument, but Marcus knew that in a town like Langston, sometimes facts didn't matter. Prejudice had a way of slinking into every corner, lurking in the shadows, waiting to show itself. Then the prosecution stood to speak. The young officer who had arrested Marcus stepped forward, an air of confidence still lingering around him. He looked out over the courtroom, his face set in a mask of arrogance. Marcus's eyes locked on him, and for a moment, he could see the panic beneath the bravado. The officer cleared his throat and began his statement, but his voice wavered with nervousness. He was acting suspiciously, the officer began, his eyes darting to the judge. He was standing on a street corner, carrying a briefcase, early in the morning, right before the courthouse opened. His movements didn't seem right. I had a gut feeling, and my instincts told me he was involved in something illegal. I had to act quickly. Marcus's attorney stood up immediately. You are saying that this man, a well-dressed, middle-aged lawyer, was acting suspiciously because he was standing on a street corner with a briefcase. Helping a neighbor? How is that even possible? Her voice rang out with such clarity and conviction that the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The officer faltered, his face flushing a deep shade of red. Well, it was his behavior that seemed off. Did he say anything to you to warrant suspicion? The attorney pressed, crossing her arms. No, the officer admitted reluctantly. But he didn't seem like he belonged in that neighborhood. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge, clearly displeased, cut through the chatter. Enough, she said, her voice firm. Officer, do you have any other evidence to substantiate your claims? Any surveillance footage? Any witness statements? The officer hesitated. No, Your Honor, but I had my reasons. Marcus could see the desperation creeping into the officer's voice, his attempt to justify his actions falling apart in real time. It was clear now, the officer had acted on an assumption, based purely on racial bias. And yet, here they were, trying to paint Marcus as the criminal. As the prosecution stammered through his closing remarks, Marcus sat quietly, his hands clenched tightly on the table. This was his moment. When his attorney spoke again, her voice was calm but unyielding. Ladies and gentlemen of the court, you've heard the testimony. There's no evidence to support these charges. Marcus Thompson has no criminal history. He's a respected attorney, a man of integrity. What you see here is nothing more than racial profiling and an abuse of power. This case has no merit, and these charges should be dropped immediately. The tension in the room was palpable. Marcus could feel the weight of every eye on him, their gaze heavy and judgmental. It felt like the whole world was waiting for the verdict. And then, unexpectedly, the judge raised her gavel and called for a recess. Court will reconvene in 1 hour, the judge declared. The courtroom fell into a restless silence as everyone filed out for the recess. Marcus sat in his seat, his hands still bound together by the cuffs, though he barely noticed the discomfort anymore. His mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. It had been a long and grueling morning, filled with tension and bitter accusations. He had done everything right, everything he could to stand firm, to remain calm, but he was beginning to feel the weight of it all. He thought of his family, of the clients he had defended in the past, of the community he had fought so hard to serve. But in that moment, he couldn't help but wonder, would any of that matter? Would justice prevail? Or would his life be irrevocably changed by a simple mistake, one made because of his skin color? He tried to push those thoughts aside, focusing instead on what needed to happen next. He had to remain confident. He had to trust the system, even when that system felt stacked against him. As the recess wore on, the crowd slowly filtered out of the courtroom, and the air grew heavy with anticipation. Marcus glanced at his attorney, who sat next to him, reviewing her notes. She looked up at him, offering a small but reassuring smile. He returned it, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hang in there," she whispered. "We've got this." Marcus nodded silently, the words offering little comfort. It was easy to say they had it in the bag when the truth was undeniable. But in this small town, where history had left its mark on the people, he wasn't so sure. The courtroom doors swung open again, and everyone slowly filed back in. The judge took her seat, and the gavel rang out. "Order in the court," the judge called, her voice cutting through the murmurs. Marcus felt his stomach flip as the proceedings began again. The officer who had arrested him, still standing at the front, had a look of unease in his eyes now. His earlier bravado had faltered, replaced by an almost palpable anxiety. He glanced nervously at his fellow officers, clearly aware of how much was riding on his testimony. The judge turned her attention to the prosecution. "Do you have anything further to add, Officer Reynolds?" she asked, her voice stern but composed. The officer cleared his throat, standing straighter, but the nervousness was still evident in his stance. "No, Your Honor," he replied. "I believe we have made our case." "Very well," the judge nodded. "Ms. Jordan, you may proceed with your closing statement." Marcus's attorney stood up, her gaze unwavering as she addressed the court. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is an unfortunate incident, but one that was entirely avoidable. My client, Marcus Thompson, was doing nothing wrong. He was simply helping a neighbor, a kind gesture in the early morning hours. And yet, because of the color of his skin, he found himself falsely accused and detained. We have heard the prosecution's case, but it is built on assumptions. Assumptions based on nothing more than racial prejudice. There is no evidence to support the charges against my client. In fact, all evidence points to the truth. Marcus Thompson is an upstanding citizen, a man of integrity, and someone who deserves to be treated with respect. I urge you to consider the real issue at hand here. This case is about more than just one man's liberty. It is about the systemic issues that affect so many of us every day, issues of racial bias, of unjust treatment, of lives being destroyed by ignorance and fear. It is about making sure that justice is served not just in this courtroom, but in our communities, in our country. Marcus could feel the weight of her words settle over the room. It wasn't just his battle anymore. This was a battle for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, for everyone who had ever been judged before they were known. As she finished, she turned to the judge. "We ask that the charges against Mr. Thompson be dropped immediately, as there is no reasonable doubt and no grounds to proceed with this case. He deserves to go free." The judge nodded thoughtfully, and the room fell silent. Marcus held his breath, his chest tightening. This was it, the moment of truth. For what felt like an eternity, the judge remained silent, her gaze shifting from Marcus to the officer, then back to Marcus again. Finally, she spoke, after reviewing all the evidence, and considering the testimony presented by both the defense and the prosecution. "I find that the charges against Marcus Thompson are baseless. There is no reason to believe that Mr. Thompson was involved in any criminal activity. The actions of Officer Reynolds were an unfortunate example of racial profiling, and I will be instructing an internal review of his conduct. The charges against Mr. Thompson are hereby dropped, and he is free to go." A wave of relief washed over Marcus, but it was tinged with something deeper, a sense of vindication that didn't erase the hurt of what had happened, but gave him a sense of justice. The officer, who had once stood so tall, now shrunk in on himself, his face pale with shock. Marcus stood, his hands finally freed from the handcuffs. He straightened his suit, nodding to his attorney with a brief, silent thank you, as he walked out of the courtroom. A small crowd had gathered outside. Some of the onlookers were sympathetic, others simply curious, but all of them were witnessing something important, something that might not change everything, but could make a difference. However small. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool air hit his face as he stepped outside. The sun had risen higher, and for the first time that day, it felt like a new beginning. Marcus didn't gloat, though. He didn't seek revenge. Instead, he quietly walked away, his head held high, determined to continue the fight for justice, not just for himself, but for others who hadn't been so fortunate. For those who never had a chance to clear their name. For those who didn't have the strength to speak out. As he walked toward his car, his mind already shifting to the next challenge. He knew one thing for sure: he had won today. But the battle for fairness, for equality, for dignity, was far from over.